Wyoming Territory, 1877, the wind howled low through the pines as the snow began to fall, thin and sharp, like it had somewhere to be. Xavier Ellison pulled his coat tighter around him and stepped off his buckskin mare in front of the run-down cabin. He had not planned to stop here, but the lantern in the window and the shape of a man slouched beside it had caught his eye. Hunger did strange things to people out here. He had seen it before, men turning into ghosts before they even died. He knocked once, then pushed the door open. Inside, the stink of sickness and desperation hit him first. The man in the corner barely looked up. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken and red-rimmed. Two children sat huddled by the hearth, too quiet for their age. A boy and a girl, both thin like fence rails, their hands wrapped around each other, and then he saw her. She was standing by the table, her arms crossed tight, jaw clenched. She looked maybe 20. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, her dress worn thin at the shoulders. Her name was Harper Whitlow. He heard the man mutter it like a curse. "She is all I have left," the man said, voice cracking. "Please, I will trade her for food." The words hit Xavier like a gut punch. Harper's mouth parted, but she did not protest. Her eyes were steady, like she had already braced herself for this moment. Like this had been coming for days. Xavier looked at the children again. The boy, 6 or 7 maybe, was shaking. The girl was even younger. Neither of them spoke. "You're selling your daughter?" Xavier asked, cold. "I am feeding my other 2, the man snapped. "You think I want this?" Xavier reached into his saddlebag and dropped a sack of potatoes, dried venison, and hard bread on the table, enough to keep them alive for at least a week. "She is not for sale," Xavier said, "but I will take her with me." "She is free." Harper blinked. Her arms dropped to her sides. Her father let out a sound that was not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Xavier turned to her. "Get your coat." She did not ask where they were going. They rode out into the cold, side by side, her wrapped in his extra blanket, her hands red from gripping the reins. She said nothing for the first few miles. Neither did he. Just before dusk, she finally spoke. "You did not have to do that, I know. I would not have let him sell me." "Not really." "I know." She looked over at him, her face unreadable in the gray light. "Then why did you come?" "I was not looking for you," he said, "but I was not going to leave you either." They set up camp under a ridge just off the trail. He built a fire while she sat with her knees pulled to her chest. When he handed her a tin cup of coffee, their fingers brushed. She flinched, just barely. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked. "No." "Then stay with me." "Until you figure it out." She nodded once, but her eyes did not lift from the fire. He did not ask about her past. She did not ask about his. But when he laid his blanket across her shoulders that night, she whispered, "Thank you, Xavier." He had not told her his name. Days passed. They kept riding west toward the Bighorns, where he had a cabin tucked near a clear creek and a small barn half buried in snow. She did not ask questions, just helped without being asked, fed the mare, gathered kindling, cooked what little they had. She had a quiet way about her, strong. One morning, as they rode through a narrow pass slick with ice, her horse stumbled and she pitched forward. Xavier caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy," he said, gripping her waist. Their faces were close. Her breath hitched. "I am fine," she said, but she did not pull away right away. That night, she sat closer to the fire. She laughed just once at something he said about his old mule that had tried to bite him every morning for 2 years. "I did not know I could still laugh," she said softly, like it surprised her. He looked at her, really looked. The way the firelight touched her face, the way her eyes had begun to carry something other than fear. "You deserve more than surviving." She looked down at her hands. "Maybe, I do not know what that looks like." "I think you do," he said. "You just forgot." They reached his cabin 4 days later. It was rough but solid. She walked through it like someone stepping into a memory. He showed her where he kept the coffee, the flour, the flint. She nodded, quiet. That night, she stood at the window while he chopped wood outside. When he came in, snow in his hair, she was still there. "I never thought I would be warm again," she said. He walked to her slowly, unsure, but she turned, and for the first time her eyes were not guarded. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "I would never give you a reason to be, I know." Their hands found each other, slow but certain, and something shifted between them, not rushed, not forced, just real. like they had stepped into a place they had unknowingly been heading all along. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I do not want to leave," she whispered. "Then stay." And she did. By early March, the snow began to rot at the edges, pulling back from the bare patches of earth like a tired tide. The cabin creaked in the wind, but it held. Xavier spent most mornings fixing what the winter had loosened: shutters, fence posts, the hinges on the root cellar, while Harper sewed worn seams and smoked what meat they had left with pine needles and patience. One afternoon, she stood over the table, pulling thread through a tear in the lining of his coat. Xavier leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You always work like you're being timed," he said. She didn't look up. "Idle hands don't sit well with me. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not trying to." He stepped closer. "Then what are you trying to do?" The needle paused midair. "Get used to not being afraid." Outside, the wind shifted. A long minute passed between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the call of a magpie somewhere up the ridge. Xavier reached for a tin cup beside her, brushing her arm as he did. She didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her face slightly toward him. "I never asked what brought you out here," she said. "Nothing left anywhere else." She studied him for a moment. "That's not the same as running." "No, but it's close kin." He took a sip, the coffee long cold. Harper touched the sleeve she'd just finished. Her fingers lingered on the worn fabric. "I used to think if I stayed still long enough, someone would come for me," she said. "Turns out I had to walk away first." She didn't say who she meant, and he didn't ask. Later that week, she found the shed behind the cabin half buried in snow. Inside, tools hung in neat rows, rusted but cared for. She ran her fingertips across the handle of a spade, then picked up a saw so old the teeth had dulled smooth. "You built this place yourself?" she asked when he came out to stack wood. "Mostly." "My brother helped raise the beams." She tilted her head. "You never mentioned a brother." "I hadn't decided if I would, and now you have." He nodded. "Name Wizily, died 4 winters back. Fever took him before the thaw." Harper looked down at the saw. "I grew up around men who never said what they felt, only what they thought they had to. I don't say much either. But what you do say, you mean." He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw the shift in her shoulders, less braced, jaw no longer locked tight. She was still guarded, but the walls had windows now. That evening, she brought out a tin box she'd carried in her satchel since they left her father's place. She set it on the table without a word. Inside were scraps of paper, most blank, some with words inked in a thin, careful hand. "Poems?" Xavier asked. "Half-finished ones I used to write before." He didn't touch them. "You still can," she hesitated. "I don't know if that version of me survived. Maybe she's just waiting." Harper didn't answer. But that night, after he'd gone out to check the traps, she lit the lantern low and took out one of the scraps. Her pencil moved slowly, but it moved. The next morning, he found her sitting on the porch, boots dangling over the edge, sleeves pushed up in the sun. "I was thinking," she said without turning, "come spring we could plant something." "What you have in mind? Potatoes, maybe onions, beans if we're lucky." He sat beside her. "You ever plant before?" "No." "But I can learn." "You're not planning on leaving, then?" She turned her head, eyes steady, voice quiet. "Not unless you want me to." He reached for her hand, fingers rough against hers. "I want you right here." She didn't smile, but her breath came easier. "I think I could be happy here," she said. "You will be," he whispered. They sat like that until the last frost broke. By late April, the valley unfurled green beneath the thaw, and the river behind the cabin ran quicker with meltwater. The earth softened enough for planting, and Xavier turned over a patch of land with a rusted plow he'd kept leaning against the shed. Harper followed behind with a sack of seed potatoes and a quiet focus that steadied him more than words ever had. They worked without speaking much, but the silence held ease now, not distance. When she paused to push a loose strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, Xavier watched her for a moment longer than necessary. That evening, while the light stretched the shadows long across the floorboards, she stood beside the window with her arms folded loosely, no longer as a shield, but as if simply at rest. "I saw a hawk today," she said. "It circled twice, then dropped so fast I couldn't see what it took. Red tail, he asked from the table where he sharpened a drawknife, had a white chest, wings like stained glass. Swainson's, maybe. They nest out by the canyon rim. She turned from the window. I used to think birds meant something, like signs. What would that one mean? She shrugged. Survival, maybe precision, hunger. He set the blade aside. You think we're still surviving? I think we're starting to live. They didn't speak again until the fire burned low and the lantern flickered. She sat down across from him, the table between them scratched and scarred from years of use. Her eyes didn't waver. Did you love someone before? She asked. Before you came here? He didn't answer right away. The wind outside stirred the pine branches against the roof. I was going to marry once, he said. She died in childbirth, the boy with her. Harper's gaze dropped to the tabletop. I'm sorry. I don't talk about it. I won't ask again. I don't mind that you did, he said gently. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his. He turned his hand up and she let hers rest in his palm, still and sure. The next day she found a wooden box tucked under a loose floorboard, small, carved with initials not hers and filled with yellowing letters. She didn't open them. Instead, she waited until evening, then offered it to him without a word. He took it, ran a thumb over the lid, and smiled, tired but not sad. I thought I'd buried this part of myself, he said. Turns out it was just waiting for room. Harper didn't speak, but her hand found its way to his again, steady. Weeks passed. The potatoes pushed up through the soil, and the wild iris bloomed near the creek. Harper began to rise before dawn, stepping outside barefoot to gather water before the sun crested the ridge. Xavier built her a bench near the door, sanded smooth and left unpainted. One morning she sat on it while he saddled the mare for a ride into Sheridan for supplies. She tied a strip of red calico around the handle of his canteen. In case you forget that someone's waiting, she said. He touched her cheek once before mounting. I know where I belong. When he returned 3 days later, he found her reading by the hearth, feet tucked beneath her, firelight spilling across her lap. She looked up and smiled, not wide but warm and with nothing held back. He set the sack of goods down and crossed the room slowly. I missed this, he said. She rose, stepped into his arms without hesitation. So did I. His coat still smelled of pine and horse and road, but she pressed her face into it like it was home. That night, she tucked the red fabric in a drawer beside her folded dresses, and he hung his coat beside hers on the same peg. They didn't speak of the future in promises or plans. They didn't need to. It lived in the way she stirred the stew without looking at the recipe anymore, and how he added another chair to the porch without being asked. One afternoon, Harper drew a map on a scrap of paper, just lines and symbols, marking the creek, the trail, the ridge where the elk passed in late summer. She handed it to him. I wanted to remember how far I've come, she said, and who helped me get here. He looked at the map, then at her. We found each other, and we stayed. He folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. The next morning, the first bean shoots broke through the earth. She knelt beside them, fingers brushing the leaves, sunlight catching in her hair. He stood in the doorway, watching her, heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. She turned, and when their eyes met, there was nothing left to hide. Xavier, she said softly, I want to build a life here with you, if you'll have me. He stepped down into the yard, crossed to her, and laid his hand over hers in the soil. I already do. By late May, the days stretched long enough for evening light to settle across the hills like spilled honey, and the first warm rains softened the air. The cabin breathed easier with the windows open. Harper had started keeping a bowl of wild mint on the table. It filled the room with a clean, living scent that reminded Xavier of something he couldn't name. One morning, after tending the chickens they'd bartered for in town, Harper came in with a note of worry on her brow. There's a man coming up the trail, she said. On foot. Xavier stepped outside and saw the figure moving steady uphill, a rifle slung across his back, his hat low against the sun. When the man came close enough to speak, Xavier stepped off the porch. You looking for someone? Xavier Ellison, the man said. Name's Gideon Lark. I was told you might know where I could find work. Xavier studied him. Mid-30s, maybe older, hands calloused, boots worn to the sole. He didn't carry himself like a drifter looking for a soft place to land. You ride up from Sheridan, walked from Buffalo. Mule died last week. Figured I'd keep moving. Harper stood in the doorway, arms folded around her waist. Gideon gave her a respectful nod. You got experience with fence work? Xavier asked. I can build, dig, mend leather, shoot straight. I don't drink and I don't take what's not mine. Xavier looked toward the barn. You sleep in the loft, work with me till haying's done, then we'll see. Gideon tipped his hat. Much obliged. That evening, Harper sat on the porch steps with her boots beside her, knees pulled up. She watched Gideon settle into the barn, his gear minimal, movements methodical. He's seen worse days than this, she said. Xavier sat beside her. You think he's running from something? Maybe not running, just worn thin. The next few weeks passed in rhythm. Gideon worked without complaint, splitting wood, helping reinforce the corral, even carving a new handle for Harper's kettle when the old one cracked. He didn't ask questions. Neither did they. One quiet afternoon, Harper paused while kneading dough. You ever think about the kind of life you might have had if things had gone different? Xavier looked up from where he was oiling the harness straps. I used to, don't anymore. Why not? Because I don't want for anything now. She pressed her palms into the dough. Not even children, Xavier looked at her, slow and careful. Is that something you want? I don't know if I can, she said, voice low, but I think I'd like to try, someday. He rose and crossed to her, placing a hand over hers on the floured board. Then we'll try. The words settled between them without weight, just truth. That night, Harper sat in bed with her knees drawn up, a folded cloth in her lap. She was quiet a long while before speaking. My mother used to hum while she cooked, a tune I never knew the name of. I forgot the sound of it until today. Xavier leaned back against the headboard. Did it hurt to remember? No, it felt like finding a door I thought was locked. He reached for her hand beneath the blanket. You don't have to close it again. I won't. In the barn, Gideon strung his bedroll tight against the wall. He paused to rub his shoulder, then lay down with his hat over his eyes. In the darkness, he let out a breath that had been sitting in his lungs for years. In early June, a neighbor rode up. A widow named Mrs. Alcott who lived 4 miles east, alone but for her goats and a deaf dog. She brought a sack of barley and asked if Harper could help with her birth-in nanny that was due any day. I'll go, Harper said, setting aside her apron. If you don't mind staying with the animals, Xavier nodded. Take the mare, leave her if you need to. Harper packed a shawl and a jar of salve, kissed his cheek, and rode off without looking back. She returned 2 days later, tired but light on her feet. 2 kids, she said. Healthy and loud. That night, as they lay together beneath the soft creak of wind in the rafters, Xavier turned to her. I'd marry you, Harper, if you asked me. She shifted toward him in the dark. Then ask me. I don't have a ring. Don't have a preacher lined up. I don't need either. He kissed her temple. Will you be my wife, Harper Whitlow? I already am, she whispered. And the cabin, the land, the quiet ridge that had held their sorrow now held something else, not just survival, not just peace, but joy. Earned and steady, like the slow bloom of spring after a long, hard winter. By late July, the days were full with the kind of heat that made the pine sap run down the trunks in slow amber threads. The beans had climbed up their stakes, full and green, and the potatoes would be ready to unearth within a week. Wild raspberries ripened along the creek bank, and Harper gathered them in a tin pail one morning before the sun reached the ridge. Inside the cabin, flour dust floated in the air as she sifted it into a bowl. She didn't hum, but her movements had a rhythm that belonged only to contentment. Xavier came in from repairing the barn roof, shirt damp at the collar, and leaned against the doorway. She didn't pause her measuring. Gideon asked if he can stay through the fall, Xavier said. Says he's got no reason to move on yet. I hope he does, Harper said. There's room enough, and it's good not to be the only voice echoing off the hills. He mentioned wanting to build something of his own. Said working here reminded him what it felt like to belong to land. Harper swept flour off the edge of the table with the side of her hand. Maybe he'll find a piece of it not too far from us. Xavier stepped forward and took her hand, the one still dusted white. Do you ever wonder what this place will look like 5 years from now? I think about it all the time. He brought her hand to his chest. I see a second room, a few more hens, maybe a cradle by the hearth. She didn't look away. I see a root cellar full, a second horse. A child with your eyes and my stubbornness. He kissed her then, slow and certain, like it wasn't a question anymore. That evening, Gideon returned from checking the traps near the ridge with a length of muslin wrapped around a broken-winged kestrel. Harper met him at the porch. She was tangled in fishing line, he said. Couldn't get herself loose. Harper took the bird gently. She might live if we keep her still. I'll build a box, Gideon said. Line it with straw. Xavier watched them from the door, arms folded, quiet. Harper glanced back once, and when their eyes caught, something passed between them that didn't need words. 2 days later, Mrs. Alcott rode up with her goats trailing behind her like stubby-legged shadows. She carried a small parcel wrapped in wool. Figured you two might need this sooner than later, she said, pressing the bundle into Harper's arms. Inside was a newborn bonnet, hand-stitched, pale blue. I haven't told anyone, Harper said, stunned. Mrs. Alcott raised an eyebrow. You didn't have to. You've got a way of walking now that says more than a telegram. When she left, Harper sat on the back steps, bonnet in her lap. Xavier joined her, settling beside her with his arm along the rail. You all right? He asked. I wasn't sure if I could carry, she said. But I think I am. He didn't speak for a while, just took her hand and held it against his leg. Whatever comes, he said, we meet it together. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I know. The kestrel mended enough to fly by the first week of August. Harper opened her hands at the edge of the ridge, and the bird lifted without hesitation, wings even and strong. Gideon stood a few paces back, arms crossed, watching it rise into the clear sky. She'll remember where she healed, he said. Harper smiled at that. So will I. That night, Harper sat beside the fire, her fingers moving slowly across a square of muslin. She stitched a single word into the corner in faded blue thread. Home. Xavier watched her from the rocker. The dog curled at his feet and reached for her hand once she'd set the cloth down. You've made this place more than I ever dreamed it could be, he said. You gave it a name, she answered. I just filled the corners. He drew her close, resting his cheek against her hair. Let's get married proper in the clearing. Just us, the pines, and whoever's kind enough to stand witness. I'd like that, she whispered. They were married under a sky the color of riverstone, with the breeze combing through tall grass and Gideon standing beside Xavier with a quiet pride. Mrs. Alcott brought a loaf of sweetbread and insisted on cutting wildflowers for Harper's hair. The dog barked once during the vows, then settled with a huff near the stump where the preacher read from a worn leather book. After, Harper and Xavier stood beside the creek, their fingers laced tight. I didn't think I'd ever be loved like this, she said. You were always worth it, he replied. She turned into him, and the kiss they shared then was soft and sure, long as the promise they'd made years past. The second room was built before the first frost. A cradle followed, carved by Xavier's hand and painted with ivy leaves. Their daughter arrived in early spring, red-faced and fierce, and Harper named her Clara after a woman she'd once watched carry grief with grace. Gideon built a small house a mile to the east and never left. Mrs. Alcott passed one quiet winter, but not before gifting Clara a patchwork quilt stitched from dresses worn across her long, full life. The cabin grew fuller with time, but never loud. Harper wrote again, pages tucked between recipe books and seed catalogs. Xavier taught Clara to ride, to mend saddle leather, to find her way home by the shape of the hills. And through it all, they were a family. Not born but made, not spared from hardship but never alone in it. The land held them, and they held each other.